Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be reviewing our Twilight Masquerade set review. I somehow lost the slides, so we're going to have to do it on the YouTube video itself, but we're going to be looking at our ratings at the time, the community ratings at the time, what actually happened in the two in-person tournaments that we had, the NAIC, of course, as well as the Malaysian Championships, as well as, I think, 6 weeks or so of online data to track, and we're also going to be talking about them in terms of how they change come the World Championships based on metagame shifts, as well as the new introductions from Shrouded Fable. We start off with a really interesting one in the Hyper Aroma Ace spec, where we rated this just a 2-star, thinking it was far inferior to the unfair stamp option in certainly Gardevoir, which was really the only deck it ended up coming into. Of course, some high-profile cases of Stefan Ivanov's second place 60, as well as Henry Chow's top 8 60, and he was, top seed of the tournament for a long time. So there were some very high placing Gardevoir that chose to go down the Hyper Aroma route. I think it's very fair to say that it didn't make the cuts in basically any other deck list, and I also think it's very fair to say that the masses of Gardevoir were still on the unfair stamp. So I still would put this card as like the second best option of an ace spec with Gardevoir, but it's still an option, and especially when you're not allowed to take losses going into the World Championships, I think having a card like this just to play the game is still very reasonable, especially if we're expecting there to be possibly a little bit less of the very hyper-aggressive archetypes going into Worlds, with possibly a little bit less trigger-happy Cramorant plays from Lost Box players, as well as less Raging Bolt action. So I think with that in mind, I'd probably have to bump it up to the 3-star rating for the NAIC format, and I think ongoing into the next format, I still think it's very reasonable at the World Championships to go down this route just to play as many games as possible. And there's the small nod towards any Dusclops Wombo combo plays if you want to have a strategy based around possibly the Lost City plus Sableye combo, to ramp your Lost Zone very quickly, throw a Roxanne at the opponent and try and get a huge board wipe, or any other Wombo combo Dusclops build as well. Next up we have Scoop Up Cyclone. We rated this a 5-star card actually, and we thought this was going to go into a few high-profile archetypes. Most notably, we thought it would go into a number of Dragapult lists, obviously ones that weren't Pidgeot-based that had to play Neo Upper, but there was some expectation that certainly Xatu builds would look to play this, and possibly even some Lost Zone builds would look to have this as well. And as you can see, we also have on the slide here some sort of nod to Greninja as an option, just as a low-energy attack cost Pokemon, and effectively replace your supporter option of the Churro and have a Cyclone instead. Turned out Unfair Stamp was just like far stronger, and essentially all the Dragapults that weren't playing the Neo were playing Stamp instead, and that even goes for Lost Zone builds, which very rarely even played Prime Catcher and often went for the disruptive A-spec instead. The one ray of hope for Scoop Up Cyclone is it actually has made it into the highest placing Regidrago list. The top 460 of the Malaysian Championships did go down this A-spec route, although the masses at the NAIC did choose to play the Prime Catcher, and that's still the most popular way online. So I think overall, I think I'd bump it down to the 3-star. I think similar to the Hyper Aroma in Gardevoir, where it oftentimes does play second fiddle, but is still a relevant ace-spec choice in a high-profile deck. I think that's kind of where we're at now, with Cyclone often being in Regidrago, but not always. And I think Dragapult lists will look towards other ace-specs as well. Secret Box, we rated 2-star as well. I think that's kind of in the right ballpark. We said it could be an option in the Roaring Moon archetype, which was essentially where it ended up landing. It was the most successful ace-spec within the Ancient Box, with 3 of the 5 that did make Day 2 in the NAIC playing this option over the Drum of Awakening or Prime Catcher instead. I'm still personally of the opinion that the Drum is the best one. And I actually also think the Walking Wake is somewhat of a bait compared to just playing Koraidon and having additional attackers in the list from what I've tested. But I can't really argue with the results that we saw at the NAIC. There were also some placements with Ancient Box in the Malaysian Championships, but we unfortunately don't have the deck list for those. Going into the Worlds format, I think it could be a nice ace-spec for the United Wings archetype, so it looks like it will find its way into another like low to mid-tier single prize archetype. Next up, we do have the very obvious 5-star for the Unfair Stamp. It is by far the most played ace-spec in Gardevoir, and every Dragapult build that isn't purely based with Pidgeot, who have to play Neo Upper, are often looking towards playing this. It's also in a ton of Charizard builds. Yeah, it's just a very strong card and well-rounded, of course. And ultimately, I don't see this changing too much. Survival Brace, we rated 1-star, and I actually think we have to raise it up to probably around that 2 to 3 mark, where it's at least as played as the Hero's Cape now in Pidgeot builds of Control. Actually, in the online spaces, the Survival Brace has overtaken the Hero's Cape as an option. And I think with those one-hit KO decks still in the format, like Raging Bolt and even Regidrago, which can copy Raging Bolt's attack, it definitely makes sense to have the Brace rather than the Cape in a lot of these situations. The main downside to the survival brace is Monkey Dory weaved into archetypes can make it much easier, certainly for Gardevoir, to take advantage into the controlling matchups, compared to the raw hit points that a cape can provide. No real surprises with Legacy Energy. Lugia is still doing very, very well in the online spaces. It was, of course, tremendously popular at the NAIC, and despite whiffing on some of the highest placements, it still had a ton of Day 2 representation, and it did make a top 8 in Malaysia, so yeah, definitely Legacy Energy, the go-to A-spec choice in Lugia, and it's basically made its way into no other archetypes, so pretty much spot on with that 4-star, I would say. Next we come up to Accompanying Flute, and Snorlax did make top 16 of both the NAIC and the Malaysian Championships, so I'm going to bump up the Flute to a 4-star card, because the Flute is oftentimes a 3/4 of overtaking that Mantine to allow you to access cards from your opponent's deck in order to block them out of the game. Looks like we were a little high on the bug catching set. Of course, it's a very powerful item in a vacuum, but the archetypes really weren't there. There isn't going to be any thwacky Diplin deck roaming around, and pure Ogerpon was overshadowed as it just being an engine Pokemon within other archetypes that had more than just Grass Energy and more than just Ogerpon to fetch out with items. So oftentimes we were looking towards like Trekking Shoes and other turbo items rather than the bug catching set. Enhanced Hammer, I think, very much a 5-star card. This found its way into certainly a bunch of Gardevoirs, found its way into a number of Charizard builds and Dragapult builds. Heading into the NAIC, it was just very important, in fact paramount, to have answers to Lugia based on how popular it's expected to be, and that's exactly what we saw happen. I think going into the World Championships, there's a little bit less of a spotlight on Lugia, although I would still expect it to be in the sort of top 5-6 of archetypes. So I think percentage-wise there will be less of this card, but still certainly enough of them for it to keep that high rating, for its potential of being within the best 62 cards you could be playing in like 2 or 3 very high-level archetypes. Ogre's Mask will take down to a 1, yet the Ogerpon only deck didn't quite work out. Very fun mechanically, but it seems like the Ogerpons work better in their own separate ways rather than being combined into one deck. Onto the supporters, we had Carmine at the 3, and I think that's probably the right way I want to put it. It didn't really make it into any other archetypes outside of Lugia, and there was also a big disparity of how many should be within Lugia, where it often fell towards the sort of 1 to 2 count more often than not at the NAIC, rather than that heavy 4 of that some people were employing. Definitely worth noting that United Wings could look to have a supporter card like this, and possibly if there are going to be any Petulant Poison Donk combo strategies, they could also look to have a card like this. With enough dig from Carmine and Squawkabilly, it might be possible to piece together a big combo to get a turn 1 Poison KO. Hassel, I'm going to bump up to 2 stars. It did actually make it into the Radiant Charizard builds of Lost Zone. Both of the lists that made Day 2 at the NAIC chose to incorporate 1 copy, so it's pretty much exactly as we expected, but it actually did make it over the bar, and Radiant Charizard had just enough results for it to be a worthwhile inclusion in that deck. Kieran, we rated 4-star as this nice damage mod combined with a switching effect all into one package, and we thought it would be perfect in Charizard, which it kind of was. It was actually very popular in a number of the Charizard lists that did make Day 2 at the NAIC. However, the goalposts kind of shifted. Charizard was nowhere near as popular going into that tournament because there were just worse matchups for the archetype, and ultimately Charizard was pretty underrepresented going into the NAIC with the fear of Dragapult coming out. It's still holding strong at over 60% of the online decks playing it as well, so Kieran is still that worthy inclusion as the 1 count, and I think it's solid in Charizard, which means going into the World Championships, who knows, maybe it might be a cut in order to make space for the Dusknoir. I'd probably expect it to be in less than 50% of the Zards going ahead, but still definitely a relevant card. I think I drop it down from 4 to 3 though, even though it is somewhat of a staple for Charizard. Charizard wasn't within the top 5 in the NAIC format, although it will once again jump into that frame for the Worlds. Lana Zaid I'm going to put down to 1 star. Obviously the Thwacky deck didn't do much. It didn't make it into the Ancient builds because you are just so heavily tied to Sada, and the Snorlax archetype also chose not to play this. Similarly to the Accompanying Flute, with the reasonable success of Snorlax, I think bumping up the Handheld Fan to a 3-star makes sense. Oftentimes it's seen in 1 and 2 counts within this archetype, but I do think it really helps some important matchups, most notably very good into Gardevoir, which is something to keep in mind. So I would expect a decent number of Snorlax going forward to incorporate the card, even if it is just a one-of. The Funky Fun Festival League deck didn't really have much of a home. Obviously Charizard dropped off quite a lot, and that was really the only reason to think about this archetype in general. So we gained this great answer to Charizard when we didn't really need one, so I'm going to drop this down to the 1 star. We had Jamming Tower at the 3-star, and I think that's pretty much where I want to put it. It's a really, really powerful effect, don't get me wrong, but it was often between that 1 and 2 count within Lugia. I think going into the World Championships, it's more than likely going to lean towards that too, because Gardevoir is so fresh on the mind. But I really don't think there are that many other homes for the archetype. Maybe some Charizards can get funky incorporating this, and maybe some Raging Bolt if they want to add a layer of disruption to their archetype. But for the most part, I still see this as a really good Lugia card. And as expected, all of our bulk trainers were exactly that. They really didn't do anything. And same can be said for the supporters. Onto our EXs then, and I'm devastated by the Teal Mask Ogerpon. I remember the day this card was released, I tweeted about how much better this card is than the masses were thinking, and then by the time the set review came round, because the Ogerpon archetype had flopped, and this was in that strange point at City Leagues where Raging Bolt Ogerpon was just just about being discovered and had very few results, and same thing for Regidrago. It basically just took too much time for those results to catch up with how good the archetype actually was, so by the time we made the set review, the only safe thing we could do was 3 stars. I knew that the combination of draw power and acceleration was busted, I knew that having decent type coverage into Charizard was strong, actually probably overrepresented how powerful that would be, but as it turned out, yes, both Regidrago and Raging Bolt, very strong archetypes, both had decent showings in Malaysia as well as the NAIC, and obviously were very, very popular online. Raging Bolt for a decent portion of time was the most played archetype in the online scene, and Regidrago in the last few weeks especially has been really upticking in play. Heading into Worlds, I think Regidrago of course gaining that Kyurem and just gaining steam naturally by being a more popular choice right now in a shifting metagame means it probably is going to be within the top 5 of archetypes, so I would expect a lot of Ogerpon action in both of these dragon combos. It's also becoming much more relevant again to have the grass type coverage into Charizard players, which is another bonus of the card. So yeah, in the end, broken basics are broken, we'll give it the 5-star. It's actually kind of crazy that we rated the other 3 Ogerpon together because they really had different homes, and you can see that with the sort of pairings we have on the slide as well. The Halflay Mask, we'll give it 1 star, didn't see enough play, and Arceus decks petered out on their own. The Wellspring Mask, we talked about it being not good enough in Lugia, and that's why we gave it just that 3-star rating, and that ended up being true, but it did end up being very much good enough in Pidgeot controlling archetypes. Now, Pidgeot Control didn't have that many outstanding placements, but was good enough, and Wellspring is like a staple there, so I think 3 is probably the right place to put it. The Cornerstone Ogerpon had a really weird hype cycle, and I think 2 is about correct for the NAIC meta, where it was definitely experimented with in some Raging Bolts early on, but by the time we got to the NAIC, basically all of the players had chosen to cut this card. But I think once again we're going to have this new hype cycle around the Cornerstone Ogerpon as we head towards the World Championships, because beating Charizard is much more of a priority for our player base. So much so that it easily could go into Pidgeot controls, Snorlax block lists, and once again as that sort of tech attacking inclusion, be it in Raging Bolt, be it in Lost Box, those sorts of things, and just make a Charizard player have it essentially. Next up we have Palafin. We rated it 1 star. It didn't help that we couldn't play this on PTG Live of course, but yeah, this is a terrible card. Luxray EX we also rated 1 star. I think that's also in line with how it performed. As you can see, there's Heroes Cape Luxray there, and that ultimately is the better option. There's a row 6 scheme that does combine with handlock style cards, but I still think the Luxray V will be the best choice. We rated Iron Thorns a 3 star, and again, it had a really interesting NAIC where it actually made it into a number of the best performing Lost Box builds, and pushed it over the top at having really good times into the Lugia matchup, and also was this really annoying Pokemon you could throw into the active, up against the Raging Bolts, and even up against the likes of Regidrago, just to buy that little bit of time. We only really gave this a middling rating because we thought it was maybe good enough in Miraidon and Future Box. Turned out it wasn't often good enough to be in those archetypes. So we were actually kind of bailed out in this one. The fact that it made its way into Lost Box is a really important one-of. I still think it's probably worthwhile playing as a one-of, because you're already playing Lightning Energy for Iron Hands anyway, and most notably because this has 2 colours in its attack cost, it means that you can still spread your archetype thin with a number of different types, and find those same spots to weave in the Iron Thorns. Greninja EX we rated a 3 star. I think we probably have to bump it down to 2. Still mostly this experimental card, still doesn't have many great online results, has pretty woeful matchup data, and I think it only had 1 top 256 in the NAIC. It does just feel like there's better devolve strategies out there from other archetypes, to be honest with you, so I still think it's going to continue to be in that category heading into the next set. Next up we have Dragapult. Did we overrate this? It's a really strange one where it only really got top 32 placements. Now funnily enough, in Malaysia it did get a top 32 with the Xatu, so we have seen top 32s from Dragapult Pidgeot, Xatu, and still Dragapult Charizard, so we still have no idea which is the best way to play this card. I think generally by the time the NAIC came around, there was already this sort of let's beat Dragapult narrative, so archetypes like Lugia and Raging Bolt really were very popular picks, which made it a very volatile field for Dragapult EX. I think looking towards the World Championships, where there's much more emphasis towards the Charizards and the Gardevoirs, Dragapult's going to have a much better time into that field. So even though I probably have to drop this down to 4 star, even though it is still super versatile and had a decent number of results, the online data's having it just around that sort of top 10 decks and kind of to the lower side of it, so probably have to drop it down from that 5 star, but I do feel like it's going to be probably better positioned going into Worlds, and I'm hoping that with more time people can iron out perfect 60s this time around. Blissey we also rated pretty high. We gave it that 4 star treatment. You can see the community were kind of aligned with this as well though. Again, I have to reiterate that this was in a time before we started to see that Raging Bolt Ogerpon was really picking up steam. So at the time, Blissey was performing well in the city leagues in Japan because it was a great counter to both Gardevoir as well as Dragapult. It served that niche brilliantly and highlighted how strong Monkey Dory truly was. But within the weeks between the set review and the NAIC, of course, we started to see that Raging Bolt Ogerpon was a real archetype, and Lugia also picked up steam as another very aggressive one-hit KO deck. So it became more and more evident that there wasn't really going to be a place for Blissey as a counter-style archetype when the other decks in the room were just more popular. I don't think that's necessarily going to change heading into the World Championships either, so I'd be surprised if we saw a ton from Blissey. We rated Blood Moon Ursaluna 5 stars, of course it is. It's phenomenal in Lugia and into Lost Box, so no questions asked there, and you can see there's also the Pidgeot EX there. Yes, Pidgeot Control also chose to play this card. It even found its way into the likes of Miraidon, so yeah, the card is just super overstated for a basic. Really, really strong choice, obvious 5-star. And to no one's surprise, the bulky X's were just that. Onto the single prizes, we have Thwackey. Yeah, we overrated the Festival lead deck altogether, but also we gave a nod to Thwackey being a potential controlling option, and it's just simply worse than the Pidgeot overall. We did give Diplin that 3-star, very ambitious. There wasn't enough Charizard around for it to be worthwhile. And if you're thinking, ooh, Charizard, that's going to be more played at Worlds, well, there's also going to be a ton of Regidrago, Dragapult, Gardevoir, sometimes 2 Munkidori, 2 Fluttermane. Yeah, that's terrible for a low hit point archetype like this one. On the same train of thought, yeah, we gave Goldeen the 3 just in case there was a new control deck coming out of the set. Didn't quite happen, so we'll give it the 1 star. Iron Leaves, yeah, 1. There wasn't enough reason to beat Charizard. Sinistra, yeah, 1 star. Again, it wasn't enough of a payoff to be good into one matchup, and you probably had to have a board full of 2 prizes as well. Milotic, yeah, interesting, but obviously 1 star. We did give a 3 star to Frostlass. Now, I think again we got bailed out a little bit here because we were mostly thinking about Greninja being this sort of mid to low tier archetype. Turned out Frostlass kind of made its own archetype just with Munkidori. And again, a low tier one, of course, it doesn't have that great data behind it, but it's an archetype nonetheless, and we do gain some interesting tools going into the next format with that new Yveltal. And even in Japan, I've seen the single prize Blood Moon Ursaluna combined with this card as well. So I think 3 star may be a little bit generous right now, but it's probably going to be right on the money come the next set. Morpeko, we did give the 1 star. It made it into none of the ancient builds, and I think like one of them are right on 60s, so yeah, just not worth a bench space for these archetypes. It could be a decent card for the United Wings deck though, so bear that in mind. And Amorous, yeah, we didn't need the Psychic type coverage from a single prizer. Ah, Munkidori. We actually said it was our favourite card of the set, but we didn't quite give it the 5-star treatment. Yes, it certainly was good enough in Gardevoir. In fact, it's so warping that I will give it the 5-star treatment. It seems like more and more often Gardevoir will be at the 2 count of Munkidori going ahead, and between 2 and 3 Darkness Energy. It enables so much, as we know. Lots of good board control, lots of ways to take mid-turn prizes, so that you can stay on your counter catcher and make Iono as powerful as possible for you. Super flexible, super dangerous card, and I absolutely adore the Munkidori. It's definitely my favourite card in format right now. For some reason we rated Phesantivity 2. I think we were talking about it being like a mirror tech card for Gardevoir. I really don't think it's worthwhile, and the Okidogi, yeah, the 1-star treatment as well. Surprisingly, Tatsugiri really underperformed. Both the community and we thought this was going to be a really, really powerful card. Turned out it didn't actually go into that many archetypes. By the time that NAIC came around, most of the Miraidons had dropped this card. It was oftentimes outclassed by Cleffa in the Zard builds, and a number of the Dragapults also chose to cut this. It still has that like maybe-ness quality about it, and possibly Cleffa gets more risky with so many Munkidori and Dragapult and Dragos around sprinkling on the 30 hit points so easily, that a slightly tankier basic might be better, but I still wouldn't expect this to go into any of the high-performing archetypes at the moment. So that's it. Not terrible this time around. I think we were a little bit wonky on some of our ace specs. I think we were pretty high on the Scoop Up Cyclone. I think the biggest miss was probably the Ogerpon, unfortunately, where I really loved the card but couldn't see a home for it, and it turned out that it only took like a couple weeks later in the City Leagues to start finding that home. But there we have it. That's the set review. And with Twilight Masquerade out the way, it means we can move over to the Shrouded Fable on the channel. There's going to be tons of tabletop content as well as the set review this week, so make sure you stick around for that. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.